The smell of old ink was not a scent to Beatrice Vance. It was a geography. It was the sharp, metallic tang of the morning's first draft, the dusty shadow of the archives, and the heavy, sweet scent of the drying stand used to blot her brother's borrowed brilliance. She stood in the deep, velvet-draped shadows of the Duke of Thorne's library, her spine a column of unyielding marble, her hands folded with such stillness they might have been carved from the same stone as the mantelpiece. On the mahogany desk before her, the 1804 naval lien lay open like a sprawled bird of prey. It was a masterpiece of legislative engineering, a document that translated the chaotic violence of the Atlantic into the cold, predictable language of risk mitigation. Every salvage clause was a knot she had tied. Every indemnity variable was a bridge she had built across Julian's staggering ignorance. Julian Vance adjusted his cravat, the silk whispering against his throat with a sound like a nervous breath. He did not glance at his sister. He could not afford to be the source of the light he was currently using to blind the most powerful man in the room. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice projected with the practiced resonance of a statesman who had never actually read the fine print of his own soul. He spoke of maritime stability and the Crown's necessity for economic fortification, his words flowing with a polished ease that Beatrice had spent 3 nights refining for him. He claimed the risk mitigation strategies as his own, his finger tapping the heavy vellum with a proprietary arrogance that made the air in the room feel thin and brittle. Arthur Thorne sat behind the desk, a man constructed entirely of silence and grey light. Arthur Thorne did not move as Julian spoke. He did not nod, he did not smile. He sat with his hands steepled, his eyes, the colour of a winter sea just before a storm, tracking the movement of Julian's lips with the clinical detachment of an auditor. He was a man of cold logic, a predator of truth, who lived in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. Beatrice watched him from the periphery, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the lace at her throat. She counted the seconds between his blinks. She measured the angle of his head. She knew, with the mathematical certainty that governed her life, that the Duke was not listening to Julian's uid rhetoric. He was searching for the true architect beneath the artifice. The maritime legislation was not a legal document to Arthur. It was a confession. He looked at the meticulous notations in the margins, the elegant, cramped script that resolved the geometric contradictions of the risk mitigation strategies with a grace Julian Vance had never possessed in all his years of expensive schooling. He had known the Vance family for a decade, and he had never seen Julian manage his own gambling debts with half the competence displayed in these salvage clauses. He shifted his gaze, his eyes cutting through the dimness to where Beatrice stood. She was a shadow in a world of spotlights, her face a mask of domestic obedience, but her fingers were stained with the indelible violet of the very ink that had formed the document. It was a small detail, a smear of truth on a canvas of lies, but to Arthur, it was as loud as a cannon blast. Julian laughed, a bright, empty sound that rattled the crystal decanters on the sideboard. He was enjoying his performance, fueled by the Duke's silence and the proximity of the royal patent he hoped to secure. He spoke of his long nights of labor and the burden of the nation's future, weaving a narrative of masculine sacrifice that Beatrice listened to with a face as smooth as a frozen pond. She did not flinch when he claimed her discovery of the geometric volatility in the salvage rates. She did not blink when he described her intricate risk assessment formula as a sudden flash of insight he'd had over brandy. She merely stood, her mind already auditing the next page, her intellect a silent private kingdom that her brother was currently selling off acre by acre. The transition from the quiet tension of the library to the suffocating heat of the Thorne Gala was a matter of 500 candles and 1,000 unspoken insults. The ballroom was a sea of silk and beeswax, the air thick with the scent of dying roses and the sharp, acidic bite of social ambition. Beatrice walked 3 paces behind Julian, her bombazine gown a dark, unremarkable anchor in a room of pastel butterflies. She was the ghost steward of his success, the invisible architect of the Vance resurgence, and tonight, she was expected to be nothing more than a pedestal for his vanity. She felt the weight of the evening pressing against her chest, a physical pressure that mirrored the mathematical density of the debt Julian had hidden in the family ledgers, a debt he intended to pay with Lady Elena's dowry. Julian was holding court near the center of the floor, surrounded by the likes of Lord Marcus Hemsley and Admiral Croft. He was expansive, flushed with the success of the afternoon's presented chain and the steady flow of the Duke's champagne. He was explaining the intricate shipping laws again, his voice rising to reach the ears of the surrounding peers. However, Duke Arthur was standing nearby, his presence a cooling influence on the room's temperature. Arthur Thorne was not drinking. He was watching. He stepped forward into the circle, his voice a low, level vibration that cut through Julian's boisterousness like a razor through silk. He asked a question, a specific, technical inquiry regarding the volatility of the salvage clauses during a time of blockade, a detail Julian had not bothered to memorize from Beatrice's notes. The silence that followed was not a void, it was a wait. Julian's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching with a sudden, sharp tremor. He looked at the Duke, then at Admiral Croft, then toward the ceiling, searching for a script that was not there. He was a man drowning in an inch of water. He felt the eyes of the peerage on him, the sudden predatory curiosity of a crowd that sensed a weakness. He could feel the fraudulency of his position crumbling, the risk mitigation strategies he had claimed as his own, suddenly becoming a labyrinth he could not navigate. He looked back at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a desperate, burning resentment. He needed a distraction. He needed a scapegoat. Julian let out a short, mocking bark of laughter, the sound brittle and defensive. He reached out and caught Beatrice's arm, pulling her forward into the light with a strength that left a bruise beneath her sleeve. He did not view her as a sister. He looked at her as a shield. He smiled at the Duke, a wide, frantic expression that did not reach his eyes. He told the guests that they must forgive his sister's presence in such a serious discussion, for her mind was a narrow, domestic thing, fit only for choosing the color of the ink and the placement of the tea trays. He mocked her quaint interest in his work, telling the room that she understood the words on the page as little as a bird understood the wind. The humiliation was a silent, lethal weapon of social defiance. Beatrice did not pull away. She did not cry. She did not lower her head. She remained in the middle of the circle, her spine as straight as a ledger line, her face a masterpiece of stoic indifference. She looked at Duke Arthur, and for one heartbeat the mask of the ghost writer slipped. She did not scream her intellect at the room. She simply counted. She counted the number of guests watching her. She counted the candles in the chandelier. She counted the seconds of Julian's laughter. The mockery was not an ending. It was an inventory. It was the final entry in a ledger of grievances that had been since the first building since she first learned to read her father's secret accounts. Lord Marcus Hemsley joined in the laughter, his voice a high wheezing sound that signaled the collective social dismissal of Beatrice Vance. To the room, she was a drab little moth, a creature of the shadows who was lucky to be tolerated in such proximity to greatness. They did not see the ink-stained fingers hidden in the folds of her dress. They did not see the mind that was currently calculating the exact percentage of Julian's debt that would remain after he sold her mother's legacy. They saw only the silence they expected of her. They did not realize that silence was not an absence of sound. It was a concentration of power. It was the private art of survival, practiced by a woman who had been erased so many times she had become a ghost in her own life. Duke Arthur did not laugh. He did not join the chorus of dismissal. He stood as still as a monolith, his grey eyes fixed on Beatrice, with an intensity that made the hair on her neck rise. He saw the way she stood, the rigid grace, the absolute refusal to flinch under the weight of her brother's cruelty. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of pure, mathematical fire that burned behind the dullness of her expected role. He recognized the shape of her mind. He knew with a certainty that required no proof that she was the one who had solved the complex salvage equations. He watched as Julian turned back to Admiral Croft, dismissing Beatrice with a flick of his hand as if she were a piece of discarded parchment. Beatrice curtsied, a perfect, shallow gesture of social compliance that was, in reality, a closing of a door. She did not say a word. She did not offer a defense. She turned and walked out of the circle, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. She passed through the crowds, a shadow, moving through a forest of light, and made her way toward the glass doors that led to the garden. The air inside the ballroom was too thick with the smell of failure and the metallic precursor of Julian's impending ruin. She needed the cold. She needed the stone. She needed a place where the variables were stable and the architecture did not shift to hide a lie. She stepped out into the night, the freezing draft biting at her skin with a welcome, honest pain. The frost did not care for her lineage, and the stone statues offered no sanctuary, but they also offered no mockery. She walked deep into the Duke's arboretum, the yew trees standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. She reached the center of the garden, a place where the shadows were long and the silence was absolute. It was here, away from the heat of the candles and the weight of Julian's erasure, that the first crack appeared in the marble. She clutched the charred page of her original notes, a scrap of paper she had rescued from the hearth, and felt the immense, crushing weight of her own invisibility. She did not wail. She did not sink to her knees in the dirt. She stood with her head held high, the moonlight catching the single tear that traced a path of silent rebellion down her cheek. The tear was not a sign of weakness, it was the final overflow of a vessel that had carried too much for too long. It was a matter of mathematics, not of emotion. The point where the pressure exceeded the capacity of the container. She whispered the variables of the salvage clauses to the frost, the numbers a prayer and a curse, unaware that she was not alone. Behind her, in the deep shadow of an ancient oak, Duke Arthur stood, listening to the true voice of the nation's architect, and for the first time in his life, he was not looking at a ledger. He was looking at a woman who had built a kingdom out of silence. The memory of the study was a suffocating layer of dust beneath the current bite of the winter air. 3 hours before the Thorne Gala had begun, before the candles were lit, and the first lie was told, Beatrice Vance had stood in the middle of Julian's private sanctum. The room had smelled of stale brandy and the damp, heavy scent of a house quietly rotting from the inside out. She had gone there seeking the missing ledger for the maritime charter, the primary record of salvage variables that Julian had mismanaged during his last meeting with the Naval High Commission led by Admiral Croft. She had expected the usual evidence of her brother's intellectual insolvency. Instead, she had found the blueprint for her own erasure. The mahogany desk was a landscape of abandoned ambitions, cluttered with unpaid gambling markers from Duke Arthur's club. Beatrice had moved with the efficiency of a silent auditor, her fingers barely disturbing the air as she searched for the blue-bound volume. Her spine had remained perfectly vertical, her breathing measured by the rhythmic swinging of the heavy grandfather clock's pendulum. She did not feel like an intruder. She felt like a restorer. She was the one who ensured the Vance name still carried the weight of a coin rather than the lightness of a ghost. She had opened the bottom drawer, expecting to find the ledger, but her hand had closed instead on a folder of crisp, clinical vellum. The paper was not a document, it was a sentence. It was heavy and cold, bearing the embossed seal of a private sanitarium. Beatrice had held it under the dim light, her eyes scanning the lines with the same detached precision she applied to a freight manifest. The words did not bloom into emotion. They registered as data points in a catastrophic calculation. Fragility of mind, melancholy-induced delusions, protective custody for the preservation of family assets. The ink was fresh, the signature of the attending physician still slightly tacky. It was a medical certificate prepared in her name, a legal declaration that would render her a ward of her brother before the month was out. She did not gasp. She did not allow the paper to tremble. She stood in the freezing silence of the study and audited the implications with a mathematical clarity. Julian Vance was not merely stealing her intellect. He was preparing to seize the last vestige of her agency. By declaring her mentally incompetent, he would gain total control over Lady Elena's dowry. The £10,000 that were the only thing keeping the family estate from the auction block. He would pay his debts to Duke Arthur with her mother's legacy, and he would bury the true author of his success in a stone room where no one would ever hear her speak of salvage clauses again. The weight of the betrayal was a physical thing, a pressure behind her ribs that she managed with the same stoicism she used to balance a ledger. She looked at the document and recognized the handwriting of Lord Marcus Hemsley as a witness. The web was social. They were all in on the count. The peers who laughed at her, the men who relied on the laws she had written, and the brother who treated her like a fountain pen to be used and discarded. She had replaced the document exactly as she had found it. She did not scream. She had simply smoothed her bombazine skirts, and prepared for the gala, knowing every smile Julian offered was a measurement of the bars he intended to place around her life. Now, in the Duke's Arboretum, that memory was the coal that fueled the fire of her silent rebellion. Beatrice stood in the center of the frozen garden, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows of yew trees across the stone. She was no longer the ghost author in the shadows. She was a woman standing on the precipice of her own annihilation. The single tear on her cheek had frozen in the wind, a diamond of salt she did not wipe away. She clutched the charred page of her original notes, the proofs Julian had tried to burn in the library hearth, and felt the rough, blackened edge bite into her palm. It was the only evidence left of her mind, a physical remnant of a life being systematically deleted. She did not cry out to the heavens instead, she whispered. She spoke the variables of the crucial maritime bill to the unfeeling stone, her voice a low, melodic drone that cut through the silence. She recited the geometric proofs of the salvage rates, the complex equations for maritime indemnity, and the hidden volatility markers she had discovered in the previous charters reviewed by Admiral Croft. The numbers were her sanctuary, a language of absolute truth in a world built on the shifting sands of social artifice. To an observer, she might have looked like the very thing Julian claimed she was, a woman lost to madness. But her mind was never sharper, her logic never more lethal. Behind her, hidden by the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, Duke Arthur stood as still as the statues lining the perimeter. He had followed her from the ballroom, driven by a suspicion that had been gnawing at his logic since he first saw the violet ink stain on her fingers. He had expected to find a woman in the throes of a common hysterical fit. Perhaps weeping over a slight, he had been prepared to offer a distant word of comfort. But the sounds coming from the woman in the moonlight were not the sounds of a broken heart. They were the sounds of a master architect reciting the blueprints of a nation's security. Arthur Thorne listened, his heart hammering a slow, rhythmic pulse. He knew this particular charter better than any man on Admiral Croft's council. He had spent months trying to find the flaw in its risk mitigation logic. He had assumed the document was the product of a collective board of experts or a stroke of genius from Julian Vance. But as Beatrice whispered the variables, he realized the truth was far more profound. She was not just reciting the words, she was correcting them. She was whispering the adjustments for the salvage clauses that he himself had questioned only an hour prior. The technicalities Julian had been unable to explain when confronted before Admiral Croft. The Duke did not move. He was a man who lived by the audit, a man who believed every value must be accounted for, and every debt must be paid. He watched the way Beatrice stood, her back a straight line of defiance, her head held high even as the tears fell. She was not a victim. She was a sovereign in exile. He saw the charred page in her hand and recognized the elegant script of the marginalia he had admired in the official royal patent drafts. The realization was a cold blade of clarity. The woman the world called a drab moth was the most dangerous intellect in the county. She was the one who had stabilized the shipping markets, and she was currently being hunted by her own blood. Beatrice reached the end of the proof, her voice tapering off into a shuddering breath that crystallized in the air. The silence that followed was heavy. She looked at the moon, her face a mask of pale marble, and for once her shoulders slumped, just a fraction of an inch, a tiny concession to the gravity of her isolation. She was alone in a kingdom of ice, her only weapon a scorched piece of paper, and a mind that was being legislated into a cage. She did not know that the most powerful man in the room was standing 10 feet away. Witnessing the exact moment her silence turned into a war, Arthur Thorne watched the single tear fall from her chin. He did not feel pity. Pity was for the weak. What he felt was a profound, intellectual hunger, a need to see the ledger of this woman's life brought into a perfect, terrifying balance. He looked at the gala lights in the distance, where Julian Vance was likely still drinking champagne with Lord Marcus Hemsley, and felt a calculated rage. The Duke was a man of logic, and logic dictated that a genius must not be buried. Logic dictated that the true architect must be recognized, not for the sake of emotion, but for the sake of the truth itself. The medical certificate Beatrice had found was not a diagnosis. It was a deed, and Arthur Thorne, a man who dealt in the highest stakes of the empire, was already beginning to audit the cost of Julian's treachery. He did not step forward yet. He allowed her the privacy of her grief, the sacred space of her whispered mathematics. He would not save her like a knight. He would partner with her like a strategist. He stood in the shadows, his eyes never leaving the straight line of her spine, counting the seconds until he would step into the light and change the geography of her life forever. He would need to consult Admiral Croft, but the evidence was already clear. The violet ink on her fingers was the signature of a master. Beatrice clutched the charred page to her chest. The cold finally seeping through her bombazine dress, she did not feel the temperature. She felt only the internal calculus of her survival. She would go back inside. She would stand behind Julian. She would be the pedestal for his vanity one more time. But the silence she would carry back into that ballroom would not be the silence of a victim. It would be the silence of a strategist who had just realized her greatest enemy had finally handed her the evidence of his own insolvency. She did not know the Duke was watching, but she felt the architecture of her world was finally beginning to settle into an unyielding order. She turned toward the house, her footsteps crunching on the frozen gravel with a sound like breaking glass. She passed the oak tree where Arthur stood, her gaze fixed forward, her face a masterpiece of stoic resolve. The Duke waited until she was 20 paces away before he stepped from the shadow. He looked at the spot where she had stood, at the small indentation in the frost where her feet had remained planted as she recited the laws of the sea. He reached down and touched a frosted yew branch, his fingers coming away cold. The ledger of the Vance family was no longer a private matter. It was a matter of moral equilibrium and of a quiet, internal method of endurance that had finally found its most formidable witness. He followed her toward the lights of the gala, his mind drafting the first letter of the paper war that would dismantle Julian Vance's life, one clause at a time. He would start with the contested maritime bill, using the very variables she had whispered to the frost to trap the man who thought he could silence her forever. It was an exercise in pure execution, not of emotion. Governed by the steady beat of time, the reckoning had already begun. The crunch of the frozen gravel beneath her boots was a rhythmic percussion that echoed against the stone walls of the arboretum. Beatrice Vance walked with her head held high, the icy air stinging the raw skin where a single tear had traced its path. She refused to glance back. She did not hurry. She moved with the deliberate grace of a woman who had calculated the distance between her current isolation and the suffocating heat of the ballroom. The lights of the Thorne estate glimmered in the distance like dying stars, and she was the lone satellite orbiting a world that had forgotten her gravity. The silence of the arboretum was not a void. It was a witness. It was the expectant quiet of the yew trees and the cold statues of long-dead dukes. Beatrice clutched the charred page of her notes against the bombazine of her skirts, the rough texture a grounding reality against the silver moonlight. She was 20 paces from the ancient oak when a voice, low, resonant, and devoid of the false warmth Julian used to mask his cruelty, vibrated through the freezing air. It was a sound that carried the precision of a blade. The coefficient for the salvage of timber during a North Atlantic blockade is flawed in the primary draft of the maritime bill, Miss Vance. You omitted the seasonal variance for the drift. Beatrice stopped. She did not gasp. She did not turn with the frantic energy of a girl caught in a secret. She stood perfectly still, her spine a column of unyielding marble. She recognized the cadence of the voice. It was the same cold analytical tone that had interrogated Julian in the library. It was Duke Arthur. Arthur Thorne stepped from the shadow of the oak, his figure a dark silhouette against the frost, his winter-grey eyes fixed on the back of her head, with an intensity that seemed to chill the air more effectively than the wind. She turned slowly, her movement a masterpiece of stoic composure. She made no move for a handkerchief to wipe away the evidence of her vulnerability. She did not seek a word of apology for his intrusion. She looked at Duke Arthur, her face a mask of pale defiance. She was no longer the ghost author or the drab sister. She was the architect of the laws that kept his shipping empire afloat, and the garden was her counting house. The variance was not omitted, Duke Arthur, Beatrice said, her voice level and sharp. It was moved to the supplementary salvage clauses. Julian failed to recite the third appendix because he found the mathematics too tedious for his afternoon brandy. If you check the marginalia on page 14 of the original manuscript, The one my brother claimed to have written in a single sitting. You will find the calculation for the drift is exact to the 4th decimal. Arthur Thorne did not move. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as rigid as her own. He did not offer a social pleasantry. He did not acknowledge the tear that had frozen on her cheek. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a problem to be solved, an equation that had finally revealed its true variables. He had heard her whispering the proofs to the frost. He had heard her correcting the very errors that had made him suspicious of Julian's sudden brilliance. My brother mocked my narrow domestic mind in your presence tonight, Beatrice continued, her words rhythmic and deliberate, a sequence of cold facts delivered with finality. He told you I was fit only for choosing ink. I suggest you look at the violet ink stain on my fingers, Duke Arthur, and compare it to the ink on the official document Julian presented to you. Then tell me whose mind is narrow and whose is currently holding your duchy together. The Duke stepped forward, the frost shattering beneath his boots with a sound like breaking glass. He did not stop until he was within a yard of her, his presence a towering shadow that smelled of cedar and the metallic scent of the sea. He reached out, his gloved hand catching the edge of her sleeve, turning her palm upward into the moonlight. The violet ink stain was there, a dark, indelible mark of her labor, a smudge of truth on the canvas of her invisibility. I do not value a woman's tears, Miss Vance, Duke Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low vibration. But I value the truth of a ledger above the vanity of a man. Your brother is an intellectual fraud, and you are a woman who has spent 3 years building a kingdom out of silence. Why have you allowed him to treat your mind as a commodity to be plundered? Beatrice pulled her hand away, her fingers curling back into the folds of her dress. She asked for no pity. She did not explain the burden of her father's debts, or the weight of a name that Julian was dragging through the mud. She did not tell him about the sanitarium document hidden in the study, or that her mother's dowry was about to be stolen. Those were matters of emotion. She spoke only of the math. Survival is a matter of stewardship, Duke Arthur. I tended the Vance name because I had no other land to farm. I gave Julian the words because he was the only one allowed to speak them in the House of Lords. But stewardship has its limits, and the ledger is finally out of balance. The Duke looked at the house, where the gala was a golden blur of hypocrisy. He looked back at Beatrice, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were the color of a calculated plan. He did not save her from the cold. He did not offer his coat. He offered something far more valuable to a woman of her intellect. He offered her a challenge. Come with me, Miss Vance. My library is warmer than this garden, and I suspect the legislative document has 3 more errors Julian has not noticed. I wish to see if your mind is as sharp as your tongue when it is not whispering to the trees. Beatrice did not hesitate. She did not worry about the propriety of a young woman entering a duke's private quarters. She thought of the variables that Julian had mangled. She walked beside Duke Arthur toward the side entrance of the manor, her footsteps falling in perfect time with his, a silent partnership formed in the shadow of a betrayal. The Duke's private library was a sanctuary of dark oak and old parchment. It was a room where the air was thick with the weight of history and the patient labor of a man who valued precision. A single candle burned on the massive desk, casting shadows across the rows of leather-bound volumes. Arthur Thorne did not offer her a chair. He walked directly to the desk and laid out the official vellum, the document glowing in the candlelight. Beatrice stood across from him, her bombazine gown a dark shadow against the warmth of the room. She felt the heat of the hearth, but she did not allow her posture to soften. She watched as he turned the pages, his fingers moving with a searching energy. He reached the section on salvage clauses, the pages where Julian had stumbled earlier that evening. Explain the volatility of the indemnity rates for the West Indies route, Duke Arthur commanded, his eyes never leaving the page. Julian claimed the rates were fixed to the sugar harvest. I find that logic incomplete. Beatrice did not need to look at the document. She knew every line and every calculated risk she had plotted while Julian slept off his wine. She leaned forward, the candle lighting the sharp lines of her face. She began to speak, her voice a rhythmic stream of data and deduction. She explained the correlation between the trade winds and the insurance premiums. She detailed the hidden costs of the naval blockades and the geometric progression of the salvage fees during a sustained conflict. She spoke for 10 minutes, her mind unfolding with the grace of a master strategist. She did not simplify. She treated Duke Arthur as an intellectual equal, a man capable of following the complex architecture of her logic. The Duke watched her, his grey eyes tracking the movement of her lips with a focus devoid of social artifice. He was not looking at a drab moth. He was looking at the most dangerous mind in the kingdom. "And here," Beatrice said, producing the charred page she had rescued from the hearth. "This is the original proof. My brother tried to burn it when he realized he couldn't replicate the arithmetic. He thinks he can erase the architect and still keep the building. He is mistaken. The charred scrap of paper was not a remnant of a fire. It was a contract of sovereignty." Beatrice laid it on top of the official vellum, the blackened edges a stark contrast. Duke Arthur reached out and touched the page, his fingers grazing the elegant, cramped script in the margins. The same script that Julian had claimed as his own. The evidence was undeniable. The violet ink on Beatrice's fingers was the signature, and the charred page was the proof. "He intends to have you committed, Miss Vance," Duke Arthur said quietly. "I saw the sanitarium document in the carriage house this morning. Lord Marcus Hemsley has already signed it as a witness. Julian intends to pay his gambling debts to me with Lady Elena's dowry, and he intends to hide the fraud by burying you where no one will ever hear your variables again." Beatrice did not flinch. She had already audited the cost of Julian's treachery. She stood in the center of the library, her spine a straight line of resolve. She looked at Arthur Thorne and saw a man who understood the value of a balanced ledger and the necessity of a muted, solitary means of persisting. "A matter of action, Duke Arthur, not of emotion," Beatrice said, her voice carrying mathematical certainty. "Julian thinks he has given me a cage. He does not realize he has given me the key to his own ruin. If you are prepared to audit the Vance estate, I am prepared to provide the books." Duke Arthur looked at the charred page, then at the woman standing before him. He did not smile, but there was a spark of pure, intellectual respect in his eyes. He picked up a quill, the feather scratching against the silence of the room. He began to write with the same precision that governed her own mind. "We will start with a paper war, Miss Vance. I will send your brother a series of letters regarding the strength of the newly drafted provisions, each containing a deliberate technical error that only the true architect could catch. If Julian replies with his own words, he will prove his incompetence. If he relies on you to fix them, he will hand me the proof of his fraud. Either way, the ledger will be balanced." Beatrice watched him, her breathing shallow and even. She did not ask for his help. She did not thank him. She simply stood, her mind already calculating the first move in the chess match that would dismantle her brother's life. She looked at the violet ink on her fingers and felt the weight of her invisibility beginning to lift. The garden was behind her. The tears were frozen in the past, and the architect was finally, truly in the room. Arthur Thorne looked up from his writing, the candle flickering between them. "One more thing, Beatrice. If we are to be partners in this audit, I suggest you stop hiding your mind in the shadows. A kingdom built on silence is easily stolen. A kingdom built on the truth of the ledger is unassailable." Beatrice curtsied, a perfect gesture of social compliance that was, for the first time, a sign of her own power. She did not say a word. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps silent on the heavy rug. She had a gala to return to. She had a brother to observe. And she had a mind that was no longer whispering to the trees. It was time for concrete steps. The reckoning was no longer a premonition. It was a document in progress. 2 days after the gala arrived, not with the warmth of the sun, but with the cold, grey precision of an audit. Frost remained a stubborn glaze on the window panes of the Vance Manor, and inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale tea and the metallic tang of Julian Vance's rising panic. Beatrice Vance sat at her small, scarred secretary desk in the corner of the morning room, her spine a straight line of unyielding resolve. She did not look at the door. She did not listen for the sound of her brother's heavy, erratic footsteps in the hall. She focused instead on the ledger before her, her fingers, still faint with the violet ink stain from last night's work, moving with a methodical rhythm that was her only sanctuary. The letter arrived on a silver tray. At 10 o'clock, the Duke of Thorne's seal, a heavy crimson eye that seemed to stare directly at the fraudulence of the household. Julian Vance snatched it before the footman could retreat, his hands trembling with a violence he tried to mask with a sharp command for more brandy. He stood in the center of the morning room, the heavy vellum rattling in his grip as he tore it open, his face pale and slick with the cold sweat of a man who realized the ground was no longer solid beneath his feet. The letter was not a correspondence. It was a deployment. It was written in the hand of Arthur Thorne. A script that was lean, surgical, and devoid of the flourishes of polite society. It was a technical inquiry regarding the third subclause of the Maritime Charter, specifically the intersection of maritime indemnity and the fluctuating rates of salvage during a prolonged blockade. Julian read it once, his eyes darting across the page like a trapped animal. He read it twice, his mouth opening and closing in a silent, desperate pant. He understood the individual words, but he did not understand the language they formed. To Julian, the document was a labyrinth. To the man who had sent it, it was a snare. Beatrice. Julian's voice was a jagged shard of sound that cut through the silence of the room. He did not meet her eyes as he crossed the floor, his cravat slightly askew, the smell of last night's champagne still clinging to his coat like a layer of dust. He thrust the letter onto her desk, his thumb smudging the Duke's elegant ink. Thorne has sent this. A minor clarification, he calls it. Some nonsense about the indemnity variables I discussed with Admiral Croft at the gala. He seems to have misconstrued my brilliance. Fix it. Draft a reply that reminds him of my position, and do it before the post-chaise departs. Beatrice Vance kept her eyes lowered for a moment. She waited for the rhythm of the clock to reach the 5-second mark, a silent measurement of her own dignity. She took the letter, her fingers grazing the heavy vellum, feeling the tactile weight of the Duke's challenge. She read the lines and saw exactly what Arthur Thorne had done. He had intentionally introduced a flaw, a deliberate miscalculation of the geometric progression for salvage fees, disguised as a scholarly question. If Julian replied with a simple affirmation of the Duke's error, he would prove he did not understand the very law he claimed to have written. If he tried to correct it and failed, he would expose the limits of his intellect. It was a quiet war of papers, a secret intellectual chess match being played across the county, and Beatrice was the only one who could see the board. She looked at the Duke's script and recognized the invitation hidden in the technicalities. He was baiting the architect, waiting to see if she would speak through her brother's hand. The letter was a bridge, built of ink and logic, spanning the distance between the ballroom's humiliation and the garden's truth. "The Duke's inquiry is precise, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice level and devoid of the irony that burned in her chest. She did not smile. She did not point out the obvious trap. She looked at her brother and saw the intellectual insolvency that had finally reached its limit. He is questioning the volatility of the salvage rates during a blockade. His logic suggests a linear progression, which is incorrect for a sustained conflict. He is testing your foundational framework. If you reply incorrectly, the Admiralty Board will find your restructuring acts legally porous. Julian Vance's face turned a mottled shade of red, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides. He did not care about the legality. He cared about the royal patent. He cared about the debt he owed to the Duke. "Then do not let me reply incorrectly. That is what you are for. Is it not? To ensure the details are attended to while I handle the affairs of state. Write the correction. Make it sharp. Remind him who holds the intellect in this family." Beatrice took up her pen, the nib scratching against the paper with a sound like a sharpening blade. She did not write Julian's reply. She wrote her own. She corrected the Duke's deliberate error with a grace that was surgical in its accuracy, but she did not stop there. She introduced a new variable, a technical nuance regarding the Act of God clauses that she knew Arthur Thorne would recognize as a direct response to their conversation in the library. She was no longer whispering to the trees. She was speaking through the ledger of the law, using her brother's name as a mask for her own sovereignty. For 3 days, the letters flowed between the Vance manor and the Duke's estate, a rhythmic exchange of technical barbs and logical traps. Julian grew increasingly frantic, his role reduced to that of a courier for a mind he could not comprehend. He paced the halls, drinking heavily, shouting at the servants, his arrogance curdling into a desperate defensive rage. He did not realize that every time he signed his name to the prose Beatrice provided, he was signing the confession of his own fraud. He did not realize that the Duke was not reading Julian's words. He was auditing Beatrice's mind. On the fourth morning, a carriage arrived from the Duke's estate, not with a letter, but with a summons. It was not for Julian Vance. It was for the person responsible for the Vance family records. The Duke requested the presence of Beatrice Vance to assist in the categorization of certain naval documents that Julian had claimed were in her possession. Julian, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of the technical pressure, practically pushed her into the carriage. He told her to be useful, to keep her head down, and to ensure the Duke did not think too poorly of the family's administrative order. He did not see the straightness of her spine as she climbed into the coach. He saw only a drab moth being sent to do a servant's work. The arrival at the Thorne ancestral estate was a study in stone and silence. The manor was a monument to ordered peace. The architecture a testament to a man who valued the strength of the foundation over the gilding of the roof. Beatrice was led not to the drawing room, and not to the public halls where she had been mocked, but deep into the private wing of the house. The air grew cooler, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and the crisp, clean scent of cold marble. Arthur Thorne stood at the end of a long gallery, his figure framed by a massive arched window that looked out over the arboretum, where they had stood 3 nights prior. He did not offer a social greeting, he did not bow. He turned as she approached, his winter-grey eyes searching her face with the clinical detachment of a man verifying a signature. "You caught the error in the second letter, Miss Vance," the Duke said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet hall. "The one regarding the tonnage variables. Julian would have missed it. He would have agreed with my mistake and walked directly into the insolvency court. You, however, chose to refine the logic. You added a secondary hedge against the blockade duration." "It was a matter of stewardship," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite the immense, echoing weight of the house around her. She stood with her hands folded, her bombazine dress a dark anchor in the light of the gallery. "A law with a hole in it is not a law. It is an invitation to ruin." I do not care for invitations." The Duke turned and opened a pair of heavy mahogany doors. "Then you will find this more to your liking than the morning room at Vance Manor." He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Beatrice stopped at the threshold, her breathing catching in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the sudden overwhelming sensation of being seen. The room was not a parlor. It was not a guest suite. It was a working office. A massive oak desk sat beneath a north-facing window, positioned perfectly to capture the steady, consistent light necessary for fine accounting. The walls were lined with custom-built shelves, currently empty, but waiting for the weight of ledgers and maps. There was a cabinet for inks, a stand for a maritime globe, and a series of boxes labeled for naval documents. The office was not a gift, it was a validation. It was a physical space carved out of the Duke's own sovereignty, dedicated to the labor that the rest of the world chose to erase. For the first time in her 22 years, Beatrice Vance was looking at a room that had been built for her mind, rather than her gender. There were no embroidery hoops here. There were no decorative screens to hide her work. There was only the architecture of the technical, the sanctuary of the ledger. "I have no use for a ghost in my library, Beatrice," Arthur Thorne said, stepping into the room behind her. He walked to the desk and laid his hand on the polished surface. "You are the architect of the 1804 naval Leon, and as far as this house is concerned, your word on these matters is final." Beatrice walked toward the desk, her footsteps silent on the heavy rug. She did not cry. She did not sink into the chair with a sigh of relief. She reached out and touched the inkstand, a heavy, silver piece that was already filled with the violet ink she preferred. The texture of the silver, the texture, the smell of the fresh vellum waiting in the drawer, the absolute, ordered silence of the space. It was the first real protection she had ever known. It was the armor of the competent, provided by a man who understood that the greatest weapon a woman could possess was her own agency. "Julian will notice my absence," Beatrice said, her voice small but firm in the vastness of the room. "He will realize that the letters have stopped. He will realize that his sister is no longer there to maintain the mask." "Let him notice," the Duke replied, his voice hardening into a blade of cold logic. Julian Vance is currently drowning in a debt he cannot pay and a lie he cannot sustain. While he is busy trying to convince the world he is a genius, we will be here, finishing the audit of the Vance estate records. By the time he realizes you are gone, the ledger of his life will be in my hands, and the truth of your mind will be a matter of public record. Beatrice sat at the desk, the chair supporting her spine with a firmness that felt like a partnership. She looked out the window at the frozen garden and felt the internal calculus of her life shifting. The humiliation of the gala, the threat of the sanitarium, the burden of the family name, they were all data points in an old broken equation. Here in the quiet heart of the Duke's home, she was starting a new calculation. She picked up a fresh quill, the feather light, and balanced in her fingers. "A matter of action, Duke Arthur," she whispered, the words a final entry in the ledger of her old life. "Dictated by the pendulum's swing," he finished, his eyes meeting hers with a respect that required no further dialogue. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her to her kingdom. As the door clicked shut, the silence of the room settled around her, not as a cage, but as an expansive ground for her intellect. Beatrice Vance dipped her pen into the violet ink and began to write, her mind no longer a secret, her labor no longer a ghost. The struggle for her legacy had moved to its next phase, and the architect was finally, truly home. The silence of the Thorne working office was a living, breathing thing, a sanctuary constructed of leather bindings and the rhythmic, methodical scratch of Beatrice Vance's pen. For 6 days she had lived within the architecture of the Duke's library, her mind finally free to expand into the technical voids that Julian had tried to bridge with lies. She had mapped the Vance estate's true insolvency with the precision of a cartographer, her fingers perpetually stained with the violet ink that had become her personal sigil. But as the clock on the mantel struck the hour of 4, a single, glaring absence in the records demanded her attention. The Vance estate records, specifically the volume containing the private accounts of Lady Elena's dowry, was not among the boxes Julian had allowed Duke Arthur's men to collect. Without it, the final proof of Julian's intent to plunder her mother's legacy was merely a logical deduction, not a legal certainty. Beatrice did not hesitate. She did not wait for the Duke to return from his session with Admiral Croft, and she did not ask for an escort. She understood the geography of her brother's desperation. She ordered a small, inconspicuous chaise from the Thorne stables and began the 3-mile journey back to the Vance manor. Her spine remained a straight, unyielding line, a physical manifestation of her resolve. As the carriage moved, she began to count the milestones of her return, an unspoken tactic for staying sane. She watched the skeletal trees pass by, their branches black and sharp against the grey sky, and felt the familiar weight of the Vance name settling back onto her shoulders like a leaden cloak. She was returning to retrieve the one weapon, the Vance estate records, that would ensure Julian could never strike again. The arrival at her ancestral home was a study in neglect. The drive was choked with dead leaves that crunched like bone, and the stone lions at the gate seemed to lean inward, ashamed of the decay they guarded. Beatrice stepped from the carriage, the smell of damp earth and cold stone clinging to her bombazine skirts. Her gaze bypassed the windows entirely. She walked directly to the front door, her footsteps purposeful. The house felt thin, the air inside smelling of stale gin and cold ash. She reached the study, the room where she had found the sanitarium document only nights before. The heavy mahogany door was ajar, the hinges groaning. Beatrice did not pause. She walked to the desk, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape of Julian's failure. She searched for the leather-bound Vance estate records, her movements efficient. She found the specific volume in the bottom of a locked cabinet. The wood splintered as if Julian had tried to hide it in a fit of frantic rage. She opened the ledger, her violet-stained fingers moving with the certainty of an auditor. On page 42, she found the first fracture, a mortgage entry against her Mussona's inheritance where the interest had been compounded twice in a single quarter, a mathematical impossibility that hid Julian's initial gambling losses. She turned further to the section detailing the risk mitigation variables. There, beneath a smear of wax, lay the erasure of her own original calculations. Julian had struck through the names of the legitimate trustees, replacing them with his own in a muddy brown ink that did not match the original register. It was not merely a record of management. It was a map of a brother's betrayal. She clutched the volume to her chest, the cold leather a grounding reality, and turned to leave. "You always were too diligent for your own good, Beatrice." Julian Vance stood in the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the dim light. He was a man falling apart. His cravat was a tangled mess, and his eyes, once bright with false confidence, were now hollow. He did not look like a statesman. He looked like a cornered animal. In his hand he held the sanitarium document, the embossed seal glinting like a drop of blood. Beatrice did not flinch. She did not drop the records. She stood in the center of the room, her face a mask of stoic indifference, her breathing regulated by the cold, mechanical logic of the ledger. She looked at her brother and saw the end of a lineage, the final desperate gasp of a man who thought he could legislate away the truth of his own incompetence. "The audit is nearly complete." "Julian," Beatrice said, her voice a low-level vibration. "Duke Arthur has the records of the legislative draft. He has the letters you signed, the letters I wrote to correct your errors. There is no longer a path back to the ballroom for you. Give me the document, and perhaps the Duke will allow you the dignity of a private exile." Julian let out a short, wheezing bark of laughter. He stepped into the room, the floorboards groaning. "Dignity? You speak of dignity while you sit in the Duke's house like a common clerk. You are my sister, Beatrice, my property. Lord Marcus is waiting in the yard with the carriage. The physician has already been paid. You are going to a place where your variables and your geometric proofs will be nothing more than the ramblings of a fractured mind." He moved with a sudden energy, his hand closing around her arm with a grip that was bruising. Beatrice did not scream. She did not beg. She counted. She measured the force of his grip and the angle of his stride. She analyzed the architecture of her own capture with the same clinical detachment she used for a salvage clause. The house was a labyrinth of memories. The house, but the path to the carriage was a matter of linear physics. The front door swung open, and the freezing air hit her. A heavy, black carriage waited in the drive, its windows shuttered. Lord Marcus Hemsley stood by the door, his face a masterpiece of practiced concern. He did not look at Beatrice as a human being. He looked at her as a debt to be settled, a secret to be buried. "It is for the best, Miss Vance," Lord Marcus said, his voice a smooth purr. "The strain of your duties has clearly overtaxed your delicate constitution." Julian shoved her toward the carriage. The interior was a dark void, smelling of damp wool. The carriage was not a vehicle. It was a mobile contract, a clause of confinement. Beatrice planted her feet, her spine a column of unyielding pride. She clutched the Vance estate records to her chest, the weight of her mother's legacy, her only shield. "You cannot bury the truth of the ledger, Julian," Beatrice whispered. "Duke Arthur knows. He has seen the violet ink. Every mile this carriage travels is another entry in the record of your ruin." Julian raised his hand, his face contorted. But before the blow could fall, the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop shattered the tension. A second carriage, bearing the silver crest of the Duke of Thorne, swerved into the drive. Arthur Thorne did not wait for the footman. He stepped from the carriage before it had even stopped, his presence a cooling influence. He was a man of cold logic, his winter-grey eyes fixed on Julian with predatory focus. He looked at Beatrice, his gaze tracking the bruise on her arm and the records in her hand. "The paper war has reached its conclusion. Vance," Duke Arthur said, his voice a low surgical vibration. "I suggest you release your sister before the legality of this detention becomes a matter for the High Sheriff. I have spent the last 3 hours auditing the letters you sent me, the ones you claimed to have authored. If Miss Vance is as mentally fragile as this medical certificate claims, then the legal framework you presented to the maritime authorities is the work of a lunatic. You are a man who has knowingly misled the Crown with the ramblings of a madwoman." Julian froze, his hand dropping from Beatrice's arm as if he had been burned. The logic was inescapable. If Beatrice was insane, his success was a fraud. If she was sane, he was a kidnapper. Either way, the ledger was in balance, and he was the one who owed the debt. "The document is a forgery of intent." "Julian," the Duke continued, stepping between Beatrice and the black carriage. He reached out and took the sanitarium document from Julian's trembling fingers. "Lord Marcus, I suggest you return to your estate. Admiral Croft is currently waiting at Thorne Manor with the rest of the tribunal. They are quite eager to hear how a man of your intellect managed to miscalculate the salvage variables that your insane sister corrected in your name. Lord Marcus did not wait. He climbed into his carriage without a word, the horses galloping away. Julian stood alone in the drive, a man who had sold everything and had nothing left to buy his way out of the silence. Arthur Thorne turned to Beatrice. He did not offer a word of comfort. He reached out and took the volume of Vance estate records from her hand, his fingers grazing hers with a touch that was steady. He looked at the violet ink on her fingers, then at the straightness of her spine, and at last a flicker of profound earned respect softened the grey of his eyes. "It is time to return to your kingdom, Beatrice," the Duke said, his voice a quiet command. "Admiral Croft is waiting, the records are ready, and the architect is no longer a ghost." Beatrice Vance did not cry. She walked toward the Duke's carriage, her footsteps silent on the frozen ground. She did not look back at the ruin of her brother or the house that had been her cage. She sat in the Thorne chaise, her spine as straight as a ledger line, her mind already auditing the final moves of the tribunal. The asylum threat was a data point in the past. The future was a realm of practical execution, driven by the relentless march of time. As the carriage turned toward the Thorne estate, the silence of the winter night settled around her. No longer a weight, but a sanctuary. The architect was finally, truly free. The main assembly chamber of Thorne Manor tasted of cold stone and the metallic tang of an impending storm. The air was thick with the scent of melted beeswax, old parchment, and the acidic bite of fresh iron gall ink, a dense reminder that every word spoken here would be strictly audited. Beatrice Vance stood alone in the high gallery, her shadow stretching across the mahogany railing. She did not lean against the stone. She did not fidget with her mourning sleeves. She stood with her spine locked into a column of unyielding marble, her fingers still deeply stained with the indelible violet ink of the Thorne Working Office archives, resting lightly on the freezing balustrade. Below her, the council chamber was a sea of dark wool and silver hair, an unblinking line of judgment that mirrored the unforgiving salvage clauses she had spent 3 agonizing years perfecting. This was the culmination of her silent labor, the final calculation in a ledger that had remained unbalanced for far too long. Admiral Croft sat squarely at the head of the impossibly long oak table. His face was a weathered map of strict naval discipline. He looked only at the document. The massive file was sprawled before him, its pages dense with mathematical certainty. To the rest of the world, it was a sudden masterpiece of legislative engineering. To Beatrice, it was an intimate confession of her intellect. Every indemnity variable was a knot she had tied. Every geometric proof was a sturdy bridge she had built across the vast void of Julian's incompetence. She watched from the shadows as Duke Arthur Thorne stepped into the precise center of the room. His very presence acted as a cooling influence on the mounting tension. He did not carry a weapon. He carried a single folder of pressed vellum, his movements deliberate, measured exactly by the steady chiming of the corner timepiece. Julian Vance sat at the witness table directly below the gallery, and his eyes were the hollow pits of a man realizing his entire life was built on shifting sand. He looked up at the high gallery once, his desperate gaze searching the shadows for the invisible ghost who had always provided the correct words. Beatrice did not offer him a single sign. She stood perfectly still, her breathing immaculately even. She was no longer the quiet pedestal meant to support his vanity. She was the architect of his reckoning. The secret correspondence campaign had moved from the Thorne Working Office to this public arena, and the grand audit of the Vance estate records was ready for its final entry. "Lord Vance," Admiral Croft began, his voice a low rumble vibrating through the floorboards. "The Duke of Thorne has brought to our attention technical clarifications regarding the Maritime Indemnity Charter, specifically the 3rd subclause concerning the geometric pivot of the salvage indemnity. He claims that you have recently identified a revolutionary new variable for risk mitigation. We are eager to hear the mathematical logic behind it." Julian leaned forward, his face slick with cold sweat, entirely unaware that this specific variable was a deliberate, impossible fallacy, a technical trap Beatrice had carefully woven into the correspondence. "Yes, Admiral. I found the previous salvage rates lacking in elegance. Therefore, I introduced a neap tide coefficient to ensure the Crown's precious assets are protected during seasonal shifts. Duke Arthur Thorne did not move a muscle, his posture as strictly rigid as a ledger line drawn in black ink. A neap tide coefficient, Lord Vance. A bold stance. My clerks found the arithmetic unusual. Applying a fluctuating variable to a static Atlantic blockade would inherently result in a negative indemnity, effectively forcing the Crown to pay salvagers far more than the rescued cargo is worth. Tell Admiral Croft's counsel, Julian, how exactly did you resolve the glaring geometric contradiction between the salvage fee and the tonnage drift? The heavy silence was a physical weight pressing down on the room, the distinct sound of a lifelong fraud reaching the end of his memorized script. Julian looked down at the sprawling document. He looked at the elegant, cramped notations Beatrice had made in the margins and saw only an impenetrable labyrinth. He tried to speak passionately of naval spirit, but the cold logic of maritime law offered no narrative to exploit. Every frantic sentence he uttered was another damning entry in the permanent record of his intellectual insolvency. He attempted to explain the coefficient, again, his voice cracking pitifully, as he suggested the math was a matter of administrative discretion rather than rigid geometry. Beatrice watched him drown from the elevated safety of the gallery. She remembered the freezing night in the garden at Vance Manor, when she cried, alone in the bitter cold as she recited these very proofs to the frost unaware. The Duke stood behind her, hearing everything. She thought of the fragile charred page, secured in the Duke's folder, the burnt remnant of the brilliant work Julian had tried to destroy. She felt no pity for the man who had attempted to bury her in a sanitarium with the forged sanitarium document. She did not feel the chaotic heat of emotional revenge. She felt only the immense, deeply ordered satisfaction of seeing a ruin properly audited. A silent, private art of survival finally brought into the light. Julian's false intellect was fully exposed, his grand success revealed as a brazen plunder of his sister's labor. She quietly measured the sharp angle of Admiral Croft's furious frown. The vicious mockery of the gala was being permanently settled within this solemn room. "Enough," Admiral Croft said. The single word was a heavy hammerfall that instantly silenced Julian's rambling excuses. The Admiral set the heavy vellum pages of the contested bill down upon the table with resounding finality. "The specific clause you just attempted to defend, Lord Vance, is a mathematical impossibility. It was a test. A man who had actually written this complex document would have seen the glaring error in a heartbeat. We deeply value the strict integrity of the historical record, sir, and your record is a complete forgery. Your inability to explain the tonnage drift or the basic risk mitigation strategies within your own salvage clauses is undeniable proof of intellectual theft." The swift dismissal of Julian Vance was a quiet, clinical excision. He was led from the chamber by two of the Duke's uniformed men, his arrogant spine finally broken, his stolen influence transformed into an unpayable social debt. He did not look at the Duke. He walked out of the council room, a hollowed man. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, the intense silence of the chamber settled into a state of perfectly ordered peace. The long-awaited audit of the Vance fraud was officially complete. Duke Arthur Thorne remained standing in the center of the chamber, his sharp winter-gray eyes turning slowly toward the shadows of the high gallery. For the first time in front of the world, he did not look at Beatrice Vance as a hidden shadow. He looked at her with profound, unwavering respect. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick document bound tightly in deep blue silk, the heavy golden seal of the Crown glinting brightly under the candelabras. "Admiral Croft, respected members of the Council," Arthur said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king passing judgment. The legislation was not the work of Julian Vance. It was the painstaking labor of the woman who secretly corrected his countless errors, who managed his failing estates, and who whispers the complex geometric proofs of this nation's security to the midnight frost. The Crown has thoroughly reviewed the original handwritten manuscripts, the charred page, and the distinct violet ink that marks the hand of the true architect. He turned and walked toward the sweeping stone stairs, leading to the gallery, his measured footsteps a steady percussion on the marble floor. He climbed the steps without hesitation, his gaze never leaving Beatrice's composed face. He stopped at the top landing, standing directly before her, He did not offer a meaningless pleasantry. He simply held out the heavy blue-bound document. The royal patent was not a mere piece of paper. It was an undeniable weapon of absolute legal finality. "The royal patent," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a low level that only she could hear over the murmurs below. "A binding document of ultimate sovereignty. It officially names Beatrice Vance as the Crown's arbitrator of maritime law. It legally restores Lady Elena's dowry to its rightful steward. And it grants you a protected name and station that no man can ever steal again. It is a matter of decisive action, Beatrice, and the action has been permanently recorded." Beatrice reached out and took the royal patent. Her violet-stained fingers touched the smooth surface of the vellum, feeling the raised wax of the royal seal. She did not sink weakly to her knees in gratitude. She stood perfectly still, her head held high, the moonlight catching the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. It was the supreme recognition that her endless labor was no longer a shameful secret. She read her own name prominently inscribed on the page, the ink dark and permanent. It was a final, glorious entry in the ledger of her life, a ledger that was finally in perfect balance. She looked up at Arthur Thorne and saw a man who had truly witnessed her lowest moment, who had chosen to partner with her intellect rather than pity her. He did not swoop in to save a helpless maiden. He validated her exactingly, like a master strategist recognizing his equal. "The ledger is finally balanced, Beatrice," the Duke whispered, the words forming a quiet sanctuary of peace around them. "Your mother's legacy is secure, your brother's ruin is his own making, and the nation finally knows exactly who built the kingdom." Beatrice looked down at the assembly, at the stunned face of Admiral Croft and the whispering council, and then out through the tall glass windows toward the garden. The heavy frost was finally melting, the pale morning sun touching the dark yew trees with a warm golden light. She felt only the expansive warmth of being truly seen. She was the architect. She was the arbitrator. She was the unyielding woman who had built an entire world out of agonizing silence, and that world was undeniably her own. "A matter of action, Duke Arthur," she said, her voice carrying the pure mathematical certainty of a soul that had found its true home. "Measured by the ticking of the clock," he replied softly, his grey eyes meeting hers with a profound respect that required absolutely no further dialogue. They stood together, in the quiet heart of the manor, two brilliant minds locked in an earned, equal partnership. The secret correspondence campaign was completely over. The long, grueling audit was permanently closed. As the bright morning light filled the high gallery, the architect turned her clear gaze toward the horizon, drafting the first entry of a new life that was finally her own. The silence of the great house was no longer a suffocating weight. It was an ordered peace, a perfect sanctuary of the balanced ledger. Her kingdom was finally her own.